listening to the Straight to Video podcast with Rob Lane.
Hey, what's happening? Hope you're well, and as always, thank you for choosing to listen to my show Straight to Video. Today's talk is a pretty awesome one, and if you're a passionate music fan like I know a lot of you are, there is so much to take from what today's guest has to say. On today's podcast, I'm chatting with Marko DeSantis. Now, some of you will know Marko from his time in the power pop band Sugarcult during the early 2000s. That band was without doubt one of the acts that I certainly gravitated to when the industry seemed just a little starved of great hard rock bands with big choruses. Sugarcult came along and ticked all the boxes. Marko's career, though, has also seen him play with the likes of Bad Astronaut, the Ataris, Popsico, and Swingin Utters, to name but a few. Today, he helps pass on the knowledge he's learned throughout his career through music lectures at colleges and universities, as well as super fun DJ gigs out on the West Coast. He's also recently completed a short run as a tour guide at the new punk rock museum out in Las Vegas, and after listening to our talk, you'll realize that Marko is beyond qualified for that job, with a music knowledge and respect unlike anyone you've ever met. It's crazy inspirational. He has such a positive outlook and appreciation for music and how it can affect people's lives, and he's open to take influence from absolutely everything, and it's a treat to hear. We learn about his time growing up in Santa Barbara and being lured in by not only the underground punk scene, but also the over-the-top hard rock bands on the Sunset Strip. We hear about his friendship with Chris Shiflett of the Foo Fighters and all of the other amazing bands and musicians who he's come into contact with over the years. This really was a music education of the past few decades, which you're gonna love. The Straight to Video podcast is proudly presented to you in association with Affinity Photo, an incredible piece of photo editing software which I always use for graphic design, and it's used to create the podcast episode artwork you see each week. And what's super cool is it's an extremely affordable alternative to other programs on the market, so if you can, please check them out at affinity.serif.com. Alright, time to dive into this episode's talk. If you want to learn more about Marko, then the best place to find him will be on his Instagram page at Marko DeSantis, and from there you can find his Linktree page, which will lead you onto all his cool bands and projects. But for now, please enjoy my straight to video chat with Marko DeSantis. How's it going, Marko?
I'm all right. I'm having some English breakfast tea in your honor, by the way, because over here it's still kind of early in the day. I don't know why, for some crazy masochistic reason, this year I decided to just challenge myself not to drink coffee, because I think I drink a lot of coffee. And every year I do a thing like in January, not like dry January, but I do sort of a bougie kind of cleanse type of thing where I just I cut out alcohol and sugar and like basically everything fun, including coffee. And this year, when that was over, I was like, you know what? I'm kind of digging on just drinking tea, and let me see if I can keep this up. And so here I am all the way in June, still drinking fucking English breakfast tea. But I love it. It's good.
You're not going down the iced tea route. It is proper hot tea.
No, it's got to be hot, even though it's the summertime. I mean, honestly, it's like today is sunny, but this whole year has been pretty much British weather in Southern California, which I kind of like. I think it's like songwriting weather. When it's too sunny outside, it's hard to sit around and strum your guitar and feel sorry for yourself, you know? So I don't know anything about Rob. What's going on? What's your podcast? What are we doing here?
Well, it throws people off the mark straight away because it's called Straight to Video and it's only an audio podcast. So people straight off the bat are a little bit confused. But the video relates to my love of all things 80s nostalgia and VHS. Usual podcast stuff about people's journeys, but anytime I can throw things back to 80s nostalgia, I'm all on board with it. So I've loved learning how much of a music fan you are, the way you enjoyed music growing up, and you still seem so passionate about it today.
Oh, totally. I'm just an overgrown kid. I pretty much just perfected, the art of being 17,
Yeah. We met very briefly back in the UK at a Sugarcult Rock City show when I was doing my old fanzine Trash Pit magazine. I think I'd just done an interview with Aaron before the gig, but I always love reading your columns in Sherry's Black Velvet magazine.
Oh yeah, I love Sherry.
We also met in Hollywood around 10 years ago at an afternoon gig with Chris Shiflett's band The Dead Peasants at the old Hyatt Hotel. Is it called the Andes now?
I do remember that gig specifically. I actually took a few pictures at that show that I thought turned out really good, and I still send them to Chris every once in a while when he's looking for cool pictures. Yeah, I remember that very distinctly. And was that 10 years ago?
I think it was more than 10 years ago. I think it was 2012, I think.
You see, kids, if you're a kid out there listening to this, just mark my words. The days get longer and the years get shorter. What feels like 5 years ago turns out to be 10 years ago. It's just insane how that happened.
Especially this year. As soon as we got out of January this year just kind of kicked into gear and we're like in the summer already.
Oh, fuck yeah. I know. Time goes by so fast. I mean, I'll say I've been around for a hot minute, but it doesn't feel like that. I mean, I feel like the 90s were just around the corner. I just put out a record this year. We re-released a record. I had a band in the 90s before Sugarcult called Popsicko. We put out this really cool package through a label called Big Stir Records. We had made a record in the 90s and then our singer unfortunately died. And so we were always kind of thinking, when should put this music out? Because we're really proud of it. Sometimes you listen to your old bands and you're like, oh God, it's like cringy, It's like when your mom shows people embarrassing photos of you when you were a kid. But honestly, we were listening back and we're like, fuck, this is a really good record. And we're really proud of this. And this band probably could have been huge and would have been huge had our singer not prematurely died because he was in a car accident. But, life's weird. It's like, if it wouldn't have been for this band ending, I never would have done Sugarcult. So we decided to put this out. So we pressed it up on vinyl through this really cool label. And then we were kind of thinking about it. We're like, this record, for music fanatics like us, I'm sure you can relate to this, Rob. It's like just the music, it's the story. And when you know the story, it hits different, it hits different. And this band has such a story, like what happened to all the members of the band, and all the people from our scene that were around at this time, the bands we used to play with. We used to play with Weezer. We used to play with Green Day, before they all became huge. So we were like, we need to tell this story. So we actually included we made like an oral history. We included a little book. You get this book and it's got like old flyers from, shows we used to play in set lists and pictures. Because it's like this lost band that never happened. Look at this one. Look who's opening for us.
Some band called Weezer. I might have heard of them before.
It was their first ever show outside of Los Angeles. And then here's this other band that seems insignificant enough called Green Thumb. Now, Green Thumb had two brothers in it. This guy named Chris, who I grew up with, named Chris Shiflett, who's now the guitarist of the Foo Fighters. And Chris's older brother, Scott Shiflett, who's been the bass player of Face to Face for like the last 150 years. And then their other guitar player, Bill, went on to start a record label called Side One Dummy, who put out like Flogging Molly, Go-Go Bordello, Gaslight Anthem. And then the singer, Buck, was really talented. Unfortunately, he never really went on to do anything else that you heard of. But the drummer was this guy named Josh, who just got a new job recently as the drummer of the Foo Fighters. So Chris Shiflett and Josh Freese were actually in a band way before they were together with the Foo Fighters, and that band was called Green Thumb. And you heard it here first on Straight to Video.
That's insane, dude.
Yeah, there you go.
Wow.
So you wanted 80s nostalgia, and I'm giving you 90s nostalgia.
Your friendship with Chris goes right back to the beginning of your music career when, like, going back to Santa Barbara. Weren't you playing in different bands and you'd always see each other around town, like this dude with long hair wearing T-shirts that you recognized and stuff like that?
Oh, man. Okay, so now you're going into the 80s, and this is where the kids were watching this are like, okay, how old is this motherfucker? I'll tell you right now, I still have all my hair, so I'm not that old. Don't be thinking I'm wearing a beanie because I don't have hair. But I'll tell you what, me and Chris grew up in a small town called Santa Barbara, a little beach town in California, it's like 90, it's almost 100 miles away from Los Angeles. So it's just far enough that you're able to not be like completely like Los Angelesified. It's a humble beach town, but it's just big enough that it doesn't count as like a little village. And it's just small enough that it never feels like a big city. If you go to Santa Barbara, you see there's no tall buildings, there's no billboard advertising, there's hardly any crime, there's hardly any traffic unless they're doing construction. So it's just a really idyllic place to grow up. But like any teenagers and like any kids, you are probably, actually Sugarcult has a song about it called Stuck in America, where you find that no matter where people grow up, they're going to find something to be pissed off about when they're teenagers. So that's, I think, the necessary thing that happens that gives you the necessary sort of piss and vinegar that turns into fuel that fuels your rocket ship and takes you somewhere you want to go. Fuels your wildest dreams, kids, come on. So in our case, it was like, hey, we're kind of bored. There's not much to do. For kids, you're just kind of cruising around, you go to the beach, you go skateboard, you go to shows. And then eventually, they're just the kinds of kids like me and Chris and a bunch of our friends that music became kind of our identity. Who are you? Oh, I'm a kid who hangs out in record stores and goes to concerts. Okay, cool. And, so that sort of becomes your thing. You're like the kid who wears a shirt to school from a band that you like, and you see other kids and you sort of find your tribe that way. And in our case, it was a really small town. There wasn't enough kids at any one of our schools to create what felt like a community. So we would sort of mix and match with other kids, like basically all the punk rockers, the skateboarders, the metal kids, like whatever, and the goth girls, any kids that like sort of didn't fit the sort of typical like all-American sort of teenage ideal. All the weirdos, we all sort of just found each other, and we'd see each other at shows. And of course, like me and Chris at first, we'd sort of be sizing each other up. Like, who's that other kid that knows about cool shit and has like long hair and like, and then eventually you sort of like just join forces and you're like, dude, who the fuck are you? I see you at all the same shows, and we become buddies. In our case, we had all, like me and the kids in my neighborhood, we had all started playing music because you're just obsessed with it. And so eventually you ask for like a guitar for Christmas or something. None of us were particularly good, but it's just something to do. And then I remember when we met Chris in particular, he was different because he was already really good. And it was like, what the fuck, dude? We're all like 14. Like, how are you so good? And it turned out because he had older brothers. So he had Scott and he had an even older brother. So when you have older brothers, if you're the baby of three brothers, you quickly learn that the only way you're going to get any respect is if you get really good. So he had that lucky thing where he had older brothers. He's also really talented, but he had older brothers showing him the way. So he was really good when he was like 12. So we all sort of, you grow up watching shit on MTV and like going to concerts and buying records. But honestly, what probably influenced me as a musician the most, more than any of the like so-called heroes, like the ones that were in magazines and on TV, were like my friends. Meeting people like Chris at a young age and his older brother Scott and some of the other kids in our town, this guy Luke, this guy Steve, like all these people, this guy Joey Cape, who's the singer of Lagwagon, he was like an older kid in our town. He was really good at music. We had this band RKL, the band No Effects used to spend a lot of time in our hometown. I think their drummer Eric Sandin, who they call Smelly, I think he was living in Santa Barbara when he was like straight out of high school because he was dating some girl or something, because we couldn't get rid of No Effects. They were always around when I was a kid. And so that was the scene in our little boring, sleepy town. There was a little place called the Red Barn, and you could go see punk shows there for free. Bands would come from out of town, like from LA or from Berkeley. Like a Green Day played there when they were like just coming up.
How did you communicate back then? What was the form of communication about hearing about gigs and things like that? Just flyers or fanzines?
People would make fanzines. There were some bigger fanzines that were more organized, like Maximum Rock and Roll from Northern California and Flipside from Southern California. But then even within that, there was like Reality Control zine and the fanzine that had no name. Like all these kids in local communities would make their own little fanzines, like little, I probably have some somewhere because I've been digging through a bunch of my stuff because I'm going to do this thing at the Punk Rock Museum soon. But like you would just see little, cut and paste homemade fanzines, and that would tell you about bands. Sometimes they would have little listings of shows, and then people would pass out flyers. That was the thing. You'd see flyers. And then of course, as kids, we would collect those flyers and like hang them up. We'd tear them down if we saw them at a record store and then hang them up in our rooms. And I saved all that shit. I have shit that'll blow your mind. Just to make a long story short, like there was kind of two choices in the 80s. You had MTV at the mainstream. You had like MTV and the radio and glossy magazines like Rip Magazine and Hit Parader and Circus and like Cream, Rolling Stone, whatever. And then you had concerts at big places like, you could drive down to LA and see a big concert at the Forum. Or in our town, we had a big theater that would have certain bands play, and we had the Santa Barbara Bowl would have bigger bands play. So you could do that. Or you could find this little subculture where it was like little copy and pasted homemade magazines made by teenagers, little underground bands that would play like driveway shows, play like I said, that place, the Red Barn. Eventually there was a place called the Living Room that was like an all ages veterans hall that somebody rented out and like put on shows there. And eventually in the 90s, there was a place called the Pickle Patch, which was actually the famous EDM DJ Steve Aoki.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he grew up as a hardcore kid from Southern California, and he played guitar in a hardcore band, and he went to college in Santa Barbara. So he had his apartment and he turned it into a venue called the Pickle Patch. And he would just like put on shows there. He would take out ads in Maximum Rock and Roll and tell people like, if you want to play in Santa Barbara, call me. and he would have shows, and it was like donation only, clear out their living room and just have a band set up. Jimmy Eat World played there, Boy Sets Fire played there, like all kinds of bands. And he would have these crazy shows. And that's what, in a really twisted, long way, eventually led to him becoming a DJ that's making millions of dollars all over the world, named Steve Aoki. So punk rock roots are deep, man. Punk rock's like an alternative MBA because you can learn how to live your life. You can learn how to do business. You basically inadvertently learn how to be an entrepreneur through growing up punk rock in the 80s and 90s because there just really wasn't a paved way. You had to just find your own way and network and hustle and be imaginative and be resourceful. And so, you thought you were just having fun, but inadvertently you were really teaching yourself how to be an entrepreneur.
100%. I mean, I've heard you speak about those local bands from your area. You mentioned RKL. I've heard you mention Toad the Wet Sprocket as well, how you would look up to those guys. And I can totally relate to that. When I was a teenager, it was such a big deal to know someone in a band, and especially if they'd released their own album, it made them legit. It put them on like another level. Nowadays, everyone knows someone in a band and everyone's released an album. I don't know if it has the same impact these days. I don't know. But when a local band released an album, I was like, wow, these guys really mean it. They're like really going for it.
Well, and it's not like we put them up on a pedestal. I think that was the cool thing about this kind of subcultural universe that existed is it never felt like when you would go see a punk show, it didn't feel like you were going to see Motley Crue. It didn't feel like these like superheroes that were on stage that were bigger than you. It felt like kids that were just a couple years older than you, had just as inferior equipment as you and just as inferior skin as you and just as inferior secondhand thrift store clothes as you. And it kind of gave you permission to do it yourself, because you saw that it was possible. And it wasn't as sexy. Don't get me wrong. I still enjoyed going to see some like giant band play a show with explosions and confetti cannons and backdrops. But that felt more like something else. It felt like you were seeing like a Broadway musical versus when you were seeing like a band like NoFX play, for example. It just felt like you were seeing some scrappy kids that just like were a group of friends kind of who'd like started a little club or like started a gang and then just went out there and did it. And like that's what they did. They went out there and toured and played music and slept on floors and, maybe made enough money to make it to the next show. They were kind of living hand to mouth. And there was something about that, especially when you're young, there's something about that seems really romantic. Like what a cool way to be young. Hang out with your friends, make up songs, get inspired by cool shit that you're all into, and then pack up your shit into some kind of a ramshackle vehicle and take it on the road and go somewhere else where there's like other kids that you didn't grow up with that have their own scene, and then you're sort of guests and you get to demonstrate what you made up in your hometown and like share that with them and then have them react to it. Maybe they like it, maybe they don't like it, or maybe like it inspires them to do something different. Or maybe you see some band play in another town because you're playing a show in the other town, another band's playing with you, and then you get inspired by something you see them do. So it's just, to me, it was like a really pure and romantic way of kind of just getting started. I hope that's never left me. I still sort of hang on to that. And honestly, not to like humble brag, but we have toured with like Sugarcult got to tour with Green Day, like on their American Idiot tour. And I've gone out on the road with the Foo Fighters, and I've been on the road with the Chili Peppers. I've observed a lot of these really legendary bands, and Blink-182 as well. I just saw them again the other night.
We saw you in Nottingham with Blink-182 when you was opening at the Nottingham Arena. That was a great gig.
You were at that show?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Those were such great shows, man. Got to meet Robert Smith from The Cure at the shows in London when we did Wembley. That was insane. But the point I'm making, not to say like, oh, we got to tour these famous bands. I would add Gwen Stefani in that list, too. People who came from underground punk rock roots and then grew to like uncharted heights, extraordinary, I saw Blink-182 play at a soccer stadium the other night, and it was one of two nights they played there. That's insane because like me and the guys in Blink are about the same age. We all grew up kind of going to punk shows and then eventually hearing Screeching Weasel's record and going, holy shit, I want to write poppier songs. Like, that's cool, We all have that in common, and none of us ever thought, like, in a million years that we'd ever, like, when I was playing shows in Popsico, we thought, like, maybe if we're really lucky, we'll get to open for Mr. T Experience one day at Gilman Street. Like, you never thought you'd be able to, like, buy a house and have songs on the radio and play, like, giant shows and tour all over the world. I mean, it's just insane. But I think that, you see some of these bands, like I was mentioning, Foo Fighters, Chili Peppers, Green Day, No Doubt, Blink, bands that came from that spirit, that original punk rock thing, they have never lost it. They still treat people really well. They still are humble. They still play every show like their life depends on it. Even though they all have millions of dollars and they have all these people working for them and all this, it's just like you can take the person out of punk rock, but you can't take the punk rock out of the person. And I know people that aren't even in bands, people that are like business owners or professionals or parents or just whatever, and they still came from that scene. And it's like there's just something about people that came up through those roots, and it never really leaves them. It's kind of cool.
I've got someone who describes something like that as having a teenage rock and roll heart, which I love that term.
I love it. I think that's way better. There you go. That's very well said. I think it's important to grow up. It's important to embrace every stage of your life. But I definitely think that it's important not to sort of throw out your inner child with the bathwater. You know what I mean? A lot of people, they sort of conflate growing up with becoming boring, becoming sensible, becoming like living in a fear-based way where it's like, oh, I can't do that because that's too... It's like, I think keeping that teenage rock and roll heart, keeping that sort of childish, almost playful spirit is so important as you move through life. You don't have to do that. It's not a binary choice. It's not like either you're a rock and roll romantic or you're a grown up. I think it's possible to do both things, but you just approach it with that rock and roll romantic sort of attitude. Even while you become, our band became pretty professional and we're out there, and it's like, I had to remind the guys a few times along the way. I'm like, this is a fucking dream come true. And even though we're good and we wrote some good songs and we can play good and put on a good show, there's a lot of people that are way better than us that are sitting at home right now. We're not entitled to this success. We won the lottery. You don't just become successful because you're good. You become successful because the stars align in this crazy way that could never be like put into an equation or everyone would be successful. It's this combination of hard work and timing and dumb luck and talent.
So many things.
Perseverance. It's such a weird needle to thread. So it's like you need to remember that. You play every show like, you don't go, oh God, it's Tuesday and I'm in Milwaukee and I got to fucking save myself for New York City. No way. You got to fucking empty the tank every time you get a chance to play a show. Every time you get a chance to make a record. Every time you get a chance to track something. Every time you get a chance to do a podcast. Like, it's all fucking important. It's all awesome and it's absurd. It's fucking absurd. That there's even a music industry is fucking absurd. I mean, fuck. You know what I mean? It's crazy to think that somebody could actually do this at a professional level because it's just so fun. I should be paying you to come to my concert. You shouldn't be paying me to come to my concert. So if you're paying me to come to my concert, I'm going to pay you back tenfold and giving it all I have. I see Ryan Roxy on your wall. I don't know him personally, but when we were kids, when me and Chris and our buddy Luke, when we were growing up, one of the bands we looked up to was a band that never went anywhere called Candy. No one knows who the fuck they are, but everyone in Candy, band in the 80s that lasted for about 5 minutes. So Ryan Roxy, who's now like in Alice Cooper, he was one of the guitar players. The other guitar player was a guy named Gilby Clarke, who would go on to be in Guns N' Roses. The bass player who wrote most of the songs was a guy named Jonathan Daniel, who would go on to start a management company called Crush, and he manages Green Day, Fall Out Boy, Weezer, Panic at the Disco, Lorde, Sia, Cheap Trick, Butch Walker, and on and on and on. And Miley Cyrus, he manages everybody.
It's crazy, man.
And he's one of the coolest dudes in the world. Yeah, him and Ryan had a band called Electric Angel at the end of the 80s, and they were really cool too. So it's all really connected. And yeah, I could geek out on this shit forever. But the point I'm making is some of the coolest bands that ever existed are bands you probably never heard of. And like to me and Chris, like when we were kids, two of the most important bands for us, for like the band we had when we were like in high school, was a band called Candy and then a band from Finland called Hanoi Rocks. And Hanoi Rocks is a little bit more legendary. People have heard of them, but they're still like they're the band that famously got cut short because Vince Neil from Motley Crue was drunk driving and he got in an accident and killed their drummer Razzle. And then Michael Monroe still goes out and does his solo stuff, but like the band kind of ended. But that band, if you didn't have Hanoi Rocks, you wouldn't have Guns N' Roses.
100%.
And look how big Guns N' Roses got.
They were like the blueprint for all those bands.
Yes. They're like these little bands that come along and they're like catalysts. They're not huge in their day, but they change something in the chemistry of the water and it makes the next crop of bands bigger. Yeah, I think of bands from the 90s like Jawbreaker and Failure and Refused. They appealed to a pretty small group of people in their day. And then later on, it just like compounded with influence and they became like sort of retroactively superstars. And then bands from the 80s, like I said, Hanoi Rocks, Candy, these bands that may be seen as like they weren't commercially successful or whatever, but had they not done what they did, you wouldn't have all the bands like Poison, Guns N' Roses, and Faster Pussycat, and LA Guns, and, you know, it's insane.
Did you see Candy back in the day?
I never got to see Candy. No, believe it or not, I'm too young for that. I'm so glad I'm too young for something. But I never saw them, but I had their record, and they were fucking great. I mean, honestly, they were a huge influence for me with Sugarcult because Sugarcult was like, you know, we definitely had a crush on a genre of music from back in the 80s that they used to refer to as power pop, which is kind of like rose to prominence in the late 70s and early 80s. And it never really, I mean, other than maybe like, I would say that power pop that saw the light of day, as they called it, was like the Knack, My Sharona, or like Tommy Two-Tone 8675309. The only power pop that really saw the light of day was usually what they call a novelty hit. I would consider Cheap Trick a power pop band.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Yeah. And I thought Candy was cool because they sort of blended power pop with elements of glam and hard rock. They were sort of, to me, one of the first pop punk bands because they had this punky aspect to them, but they also have this power pop vibe. And I don't think they would ever identify themselves as that. But to me, there's a straight line from like the Ramones and the Knack to Candy, and maybe along the way the Descendants onto like Green Day and Screeching Weasel and the Queers, and, you know, and then through into the 90s, like with Blink-182, and then eventually to what sort of got morphed into what they eventually started just referring to as pop punk. And it's the same thing with emo. To me, there's a straight line between, you know, Sunny Day Real Estate and then Jawbreaker and stuff like that. That was a little bit more like dark, serious, and then into the 90s with what they would eventually call that. To me, it's fascinating. I'm not sectarian. I don't like have this like, you either like this or you like that. I just love music. You know, I love all kinds of shit.
And if people really want to admit it, there is a straight line between the first Poison album and old school punk rock, because that's a punk rock album. I don't care what anybody says.
Oh, it's a fucking great record. Yeah, that first Poison record, by all the things people say about punk rock, to me, Poison and Guns N' Roses and Faster Pussycat really felt like punk rock because you'd see them out there hustling, they'd passing out flyers for their shows, putting together their own shit, putting together their own shows. There was no platform when they were starting out in the 80s. There was no platform for what they did. And so they sort of lived outside of the law and kind of created their own weird little scene. But there was no home for them. So they had to sort of get like folded into what they called hair metal. But I always thought it was wrong. I never accepted when people would call Hanoi Rocks a metal band. I'm like, no, they weren't. They were something different. It's just that there wasn't enough of them to call it something.
Yeah.
Say the same thing about Sugarcult. We got lumped in with like emo and pop punk because it was the closest community that would sort of take us in from the cold. Honestly, I tell you right now, like when me and Tim were putting it together, we never once ever said we're forming a pop punk band or we're forming an emo band. We didn't even know what that really was. We honestly thought we were forming a band that was influenced by late 70s music like the Cars and Elvis Costello and Blondie and Jam. And then we were like, let's take that and mix it with the Foo Fighters and Weezer and Nirvana. You know, mix it with like 90s modern rock. And then it sort of just came out like Sugarcult. It's like when you're trying to make yourself something to eat. You're like, okay, I'm limited to these ingredients, but I feel like having something like this. And then you sort of put it together and you have to improvise and mix and match. And then you end up with something that maybe either is like even more delicious than what you expected or is fucking terrible. Hey, there's a reason why you don't mix Greek food and Mexican food. Or there's a reason why you don't put salt in your coffee.
But you got to try it. You never know. It sounds pretty good.
Some things don't work. But in our case, it was like the combination of who we were as individuals and the kinds of records we were digging on at the time. And I had played in a couple bands that you would identify as punk bands, like the Swingin Utters. I played with them for a little while. I played with the Ataris for a little while. Before Sugarcult, we felt like everyone and their grandma has like a punk band. And I was kind of bored with it. I was like, I've been playing in bands like this for years. Let's do something different. What hasn't been done? Both had that in common. We would just go to used record stores and like dig up old records from the late 70s and early 80s. And we're just like, this is such a cool aesthetic, such cool songwriting. But, without denying that we loved Green Day, we loved Nirvana, we loved the stuff that was happening. I mean, Sugarcult formed in 99. So you got to figure like we had this whole amazing heritage of bands that had happened in the 90s that we could sort of draw influence from.
The 90s stuff was just this hive of creativity. There's no telling what was going to come out.
Yeah, I mean, not to talk shit though, but by the end of the 90s, like in my opinion, things were pretty shitty. Like it was like nu metal was like the big thing, and that was like something I just couldn't really get down with. Everybody and their grandma had like a nu metal band. Everyone was trying to be Limp Bizkit. Grunge had like gone from this really cool thing with like Nirvana and Soundgarden, and it had devolved into like these sort of like pop grunge bands like Candlebox and Creed. And everywhere I looked, there was something that kind of made me hold my nose. At that point, I just dove deeper underground. I was into like Tom Waits and John Spencer Blues Explosion and just like, Refuse. And I was just always just attracted to shit that lived outside of the law. But when it came to forming a band with Tim and Aaron and Ben, do what became Sugarcult, the idea wasn't let's form a band so we can take advantage of this huge movement that's happening right now called pop punk and emo, because that didn't happen yet. That set of waves hadn't come into the ocean yet. The idea was let's form the band we wish existed. Let's form the band we wish we could go see, but we fucking can't find because everyone's trying to be Limp Bizkit right now. So we formed our band as sort of a self-indulgent exercise of like, let's be the change we want to see.
Was it pretty instant though, that sound? Or did it take a while to kind of forge it?
Not at all. Not at all. It didn't. It took a long time. It took a while to find its footing. The songs were a little bit here, a little bit there. And then when I got in the band, we kicked everything up a notch. It was like I showed up with like a giant bottle of hot sauce. I was like, let's just make this more spicy. Let's make the songs faster. Let's cut some of these parts out. Let's put some of this in. And so we sort of balanced each other out. It just injected it with a little bit more like attitude and just like, I guess, punk rock spirit. But at the same time, I was very adamant about we are not trying to form a punk band. The last thing the world needs right now is another punk band. There's plenty of great punk bands out there. We don't need to be another one. And also, just in my never to be humble opinion, Rob, I think the mistake a lot of punk bands make is by trying to be punk. If you try to form a punk band, that's the opposite of punk. I think you should just try to form a band. And if you have a punk rock spirit, it's going to come out and feel punk. It shouldn't be this like, oh, okay, I'm punk, so I got to do my hair like this, and I got to act like this, and I got to sing about this, and I got to jump around like this. Like, to me, it's counterintuitive to the original spirit of that shit that I thought was so cool when I first kind of encountered it. There's that old saying, it's attributed to Louis Armstrong when he said about jazz. He said, if you have to ask, you'll never know. Like when asked, what is jazz? And I think that's the same thing with punk rock. It's like, if you have to ask, you'll never know. You fucking know it when you feel it. The band could come out with all the right hairdos and all the right guitar tones and all the right subject matter and all the right stage moves. And you can watch them and be like, this is fucking lame. And then see another band and be like, I get it. This must be what they mean by punk rock. You don't get to choose that you're going to be a punk band. I say this all the time with people I work with now. I'm like, you don't get to choose to write a pop song. When you try to write a hit song, you're not going to write a hit song. It's elusive. If you try to write a hit song, you're going to be taking yourself out. You're going to be removing the most necessary ingredient, which is authenticity and the ability for people to believe what you're fucking singing about, which is the most important thing. What makes a song a hit is usually because the person who's delivering it is good at making you believe that they mean it. And there's something about it that's catchy or whatever. So you can't try to write a hit song. You can't try to be a punk band. You can't try to fall in love.
Yeah. Exactly.
You know what I mean? You have to just open yourself up to the possibility. And the rest is, it's kind of out of your control,
Something interesting you were saying like about bands like Candy earlier on, like the influence stuff, and also in the 90s and early 2000s, there was nobody doing that kind of really catchy guitar rock stuff. The Hollywood hard rock scene was something that made me want to be in a band. In the early 2000s, nobody was doing that stuff. So when me and my buddy were putting a band together around that time, we gravitated to certain bands, Sugarcult being one of them, Marvelous 3, 40 Foot Ringo, Bowling for Soup. And you realize when you scratch the surface, there's like a direct link there. Either someone is from that scene, like Butch Walker was in those bands, Steve Brown from Trickster, he was in those bands, or they grew up on it too, like yourselves, the dudes from Bowling for Soup. Jarrett's in a video wearing an LA Gun shirt. So there's that connection. It's not totally the same kind of music, but it's hooky, radio-friendly guitar music that sounds huge on the radio. I think the hard rock scene gets very overlooked and underappreciated for what it forged back then. I don't know if you agree with that.
I think you make a really important point there. And there was a time when we were growing up, I think it just happens to be generational because I'm around the same age as Jarrett from Bowling for Soup. I've talked to him about this. And actually, Billy and Mike from Green Day, talked to them about this a lot. We were that interesting generation that was like too young to be there when punk rock first happened. So by the time we became aware of punk rock, it had already sort of dissipated into the late 80s and kind of become like interspersed with metal and with indie rock. You had bands like The Replacements, but by the time I caught onto The Replacements, they were already making more like songwritery kind of power pop records. But then you go back and listen to their early shit and you're like, holy shit, this is like a straight up punk band. We had this great college rock station when I was growing up in Santa Barbara called KCSB. And it was kind of another little portal into a universe, where you could find out about cool shit. So I found out about Husker Du and early Soul Asylum. But at the same time, we were like kids and we lived close enough to LA that we could see these bands like coming up. Like we'd see flyers or like little magazines with like early ads from them. And we'd see Poison, Guns N' Roses, Jet Boy, LA Guns, Faster Pussycat, all that. And we were aware of it, and we kind of thought it was this like cool little secret thing that no one else knew about. We could sort of have it all to ourselves. And then those bands all got record deals and became huge. It was the first time where we sort of patted ourselves on the back and we're like, dude, it's an ambivalent feeling because you feel like on one hand it's bittersweet because you're like, oh shit, now these bands that we sort of held precious to us, we had all to ourselves. We were like the little like annoying kids that would like write them letters and like go to their shows and show up at sound check and like get pictures with them. We were like little punters, So now we're like, well, now we have to share these bands with the world and they're probably going to be misunderstood. And we saw that start to happen where it was like, oh, they're just getting lumped in with like Bon Jovi. And we're like, no, they're so much more special than that. We held it so precious and we were like, oh, now they're going to go out there to the world and the publicists are going to have their way with them. And so it was bittersweet in that respect, but it was a real lesson for us because we felt like, hey, this is kind of fucking cool because it sort of validated our instincts. We're like, we somehow found this shit before everybody else did. And we thought, this is cool. Why isn't this big? And then it became big. So it was like, how fucking cool is that? And then honestly, the same thing happened once we found bands like Green Day and Jawbreaker and bands like that. Like that was kind of another obsession, finding all those bands when they were still playing Gilman Street and on Lookout Records or whatever. And then some of those bands, when like Green Day and The Offspring broke huge, it was mind blowing to us because it was like our generation's arrival. There was Nirvana before that. Nirvana still felt like the people that were like 5 years older than me. Nirvana was the culmination of The Replacements and Soul Asylum and Husker Du and all the sort of college rock that was happening in the 80s, like touring around in vans playing, and Dinosaur Jr. and Sonic Youth and what I'm talking about, all that kind of stuff. Jesus Lizard. Nirvana was the sort of mainstream breakthrough culmination of all of that had been building up. But Green Day was the mainstream breakthrough, and The Offspring, I suppose, were the mainstream breakthroughs of the stuff that we had grown up kind of checking out in like tiny little driveways and places. So it was kind of cool. But to answer your question, like years later, I would grow up and tour with those bands and hang out with them. And we had that same conversation. We're like, dude, Billy Joe and me were talking about how that first Poison record and the first Faster Pussycat record are like important stepping stones between early 80s punk rock and 90s punk and eventually early 2000s, and all that. It's like, if you listen to the first Faster Pussycat record, you listen to the first Poison record, and then you listen to Green Day, it's going to make a lot of sense. And we're all from that generation. There was that weird thing where you were a little kid with the burning embers of classic rock and the beginning flames of MTV. And then you become a teenager when like all this shit's sort of happening and Guns N' Roses and then eventually Nirvana and all this. We just happened to be born at the time where all that shit was happening. Rage Against the Machine. And all this kind of exciting shit was happening. Soundgarden and Oasis and Weezer and just one thing after another. But a lot of it was inseminated by 80s culture because you talk to Billy from Green Day, he's going to talk about Faster Pussycat and Poison. You talk to Rivers from Weezer. Rivers was the guitar player of a heavy metal band called Avant Garde from Connecticut, and they moved to Hollywood to make it big. Okay, so it was Rivers on guitar, this guy Kevin Rydell on vocals, and this guy Justin Fisher on bass. They moved to Hollywood with all their hair and all their crazy guitar solos. They got here and like none of that shit was happening anymore. And so then they all like, little by little, they like Rivers started working at Tower Records on Sunset, and eventually he heard Nirvana Nevermind. I think he has a song about it. And they all started to cut their hair, start their own bands. Rivers formed a band called Weezer. Kevin formed a band called Lunchbox that eventually became a band called Rydell High. Great fucking record, by the way, if you can ever dig it up, Rydell High. And then Justin formed a band called Shuffle Puck that also made a great record for Interscope, but it got shelved and never saw the light of day. But if you were a real geek, you want to look it up, Shuffle Puck. So there was like this one little heavy metal band from Connecticut that moved to LA and broke into like all these bands that sort of sounded similar. But I mean, if you listen to like that first Weezer record, he even name checks like his Kiss posters on his wall. Rivers is like a full-on 80s metal shredding guitar player. Same with Butch Walker. He had that band South Gang and they moved to LA. So I talked to all these guys about that. And it is a really weird thing. And it's nothing like, I mean, even Chris from the Foos, like we talk about, there was a time period where like we were almost kind of embarrassed to admit that we grew up listening to some of those bands. I mean, we also loved NoFX and RKL and Bad Religion and The Descendants. We loved all that shit too. I think that we had to fill in the blanks with our imagination, and we were too young and too optimistic to realize that you couldn't have a Bad Religion record and also a Faster Pussycat record. So we just liked it all. We love music. And then we'd go back and buy old records. We'd buy The Clash, we'd buy the Rolling Stones, and we'd buy Mott the Hoople and David Bowie. And we just were students of music. We just loved to learn about it and listen to it. And, of course you go through phases where right now you're only listening to like DRI and Suicidal Tendencies and Corrosion of Conformity and Excel. And then other times you're just listening to Hanoi Rocks and The Cult and Guns N' Roses. And other times you're listening to whatever, the Posies and Matthew Sweet. You go through phases, but you never stop liking what you used to like, because for us it wasn't this like cultural thing where like, well, I'm not allowed to like that kind of music because I identify myself as a heavy metaler, or I identify myself as a hardcore kid, or I identify myself as a ska punker. It's like, I'm very grateful that I never fell into that kind of thing where it was always like, hey man, I just want to be able to like love music and check it all out. To me, it's just so fun. It's like being a foodie. You just always want to try different types of food and like dig deeper into the nerdiness of it all. Like you want to try not just Indian food, but like specific parts of India, like food that comes from different parts of India. You're not just happy enough to have a taco or a burrito. You want to learn about like interior Mexican food and different types of sauces. And same thing with music. It's like you just get into it and you want to learn about it all. I mean, there's some shit that I don't like. There's a lot of music I don't like, but I'm not going to burn a lot of calories like hating on something, because that's like, why? Just because someone doesn't like sushi, you're not going to call them an idiot. You're going to be like, oh, okay, well, that's not for you. Just like certain things you don't like. I don't know why I don't like what I don't like. I just don't like it. So, but I'm not going to be so self-important as to believe that because I like it, everyone else should like it, or because I hate it, everyone else should hate it. It's like, fuck that.
Correct me if I'm wrong. You've mentioned the band Jetboy a couple of times. Am I right that Chris is in the Feel the Shake video? You wasn't in that as well, was you?
I am too, yeah.
Yes!
Me and Chris Shiflett and our buddy Luke Tierney. We are kids in the front row of that video. Yeah.
Amazing.
And I had to sneak. I had a pretty strict mom. She only let me go to LA once a month back then. And so I had to lie to my mom because they were shooting the video down in LA, and our friend who was older than us was going to drive us down because I think we were like 14 or 15 at the time. This is how I did it. So kids, pay attention. Get out your pencils and take notes here. How to Outsmart Your Parents by Marko DeSantis. Okay, so I was like, okay, my mom's not going to question me if I go to the beach because she's just going to figure I'm not calling home because I'm in the water. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go to the beach with Luke and Chris, and we're going to go like, I don't know, surfing or whatever. And so I packed my bag. I left the house in my swim trunks and beach wear. I had my bag that I would normally keep my wetsuit and stuff like that in, but inside it instead was my creepers and my stretch jeans and my leather jacket or whatever. And so I left the house saying I'm going to the beach for the day. Immediately got to their house, changed into my rock and roll clothes, and we went down to Hollywood. We were in the Feel the Shake video, and then we got home, and I remember wetting my hair in the sink and changing back into my clothes so I could pretend that I had been at the beach all day, So yeah, kind of funny.
How was that video shoot?
It was really boring, I mean, it was exciting for us because we'd never done anything like that before. But if you've ever been on the set of a video, our band made a bunch of videos. It's hurry up and wait. We're going to do this again. Oh, we got to do it again. We got to do it again. All right, we're going to do that again. All right, we're going to do it again. Everyone pretend you're excited and jump up and down. Kind of interesting for us as kids to see it from behind the scenes like that. So yeah, but it was a trip. Yeah, I always felt bad for Jet Boy because I thought they were one of the coolest bands, but somehow it just didn't translate once they got a record deal and made records. What was cool about Jet Boy didn't really translate to their records. I think they were one of those bands similar to Hanoi Rock, similar to Cheap Trick. There isn't just a foolproof place to put them where they're going to definitely take root. And I think that what the record label did to Jet Boy was they sort of over-processed. They sanded off the parts of Jet Boy that made Jet Boy cool, And I think it's the flaws, rough edges that make something special, and they kind of polish them up a little too much. Well, I love those guys in Jet Boy, and I love the idea of Jet Boy, but I just don't feel like that record, Feel the Shake, or the one they made after it, they just didn't capture them in the best light.
Did you record the video off MTV? Was you there with the VCR ready to press record when it came on?
Oh, I'm sure I have a VHS of that somewhere. Yeah. Straight to video.
You're doing lots of music lectures now and stuff, but I think you're taking it from a different angle. You're not going from the textbook thing, which I think is really important with the music industry, because something you've said in the past is becoming a success in this industry. It's not simply about getting the education, landing the certificate, and then you get the job. It doesn't work like that. I always say most careers, if you have something in mind, you can train for it, you get the qualification. If you're good enough, then you'll probably become that doctor, or you'll become that lawyer, or that builder, or that plumber. But music, certainly the performer aspect, there are so many other variables that come into it. You really have to love it to keep going, but you never know what path you'll go down. So what approach do you take? Is it passing on advice you've been given, or the experiences you've learned? What angle are you taking with the lectures which you give?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. Like I said somewhere in our talk today, I don't think there's it's not like a 1 + 1 = 2 equation. There's not some quick equation. And I'm glad that's the case, because it would be boring. Making art shouldn't be like baking. It shouldn't be this scientific thing where you put this much baking soda and this much flour and this much salt, and if you don't do it right, it's not going to rise. It shouldn't be this kind of mathematical scientific thing. It should be much more... It should be done with feel and much more locally sourced. What have you got? I think people make a mistake when they say, I'm forming a band. I need people that like this style of music. Because then what happens is you get a bunch of people, speaking the exact same language, and you eliminated the possibility of something going wrong. And to me, something going wrong is what makes something fucking awesome. I don't know who said it, but it's the flaw that proves the authenticity of the diamond. So if you make something too cookie cutter perfect, it's probably not going to be as magic. You have to allow for that possibility of something about it to be kind of wrong, but in just the right way. So just the idea of using your influences rather than trying to imitate your influences. I mean, it makes sense early on when you're a kid just trying to figure it out, but I think that letting go of imitation and trying to embrace innovation. And it doesn't mean you have to be different for the sake of being different. You just find your own little sort of secret sauce. Your own spin on something. If you're going to do something that's traditional, play rock and roll or whatever it is, finding something about it that's going to move it forward. Because I think a lot of people just study the past and they get it down to a science, and then they do a really good job emulating it. And that's cool too. I heard a great record this year. Actually, Joey from Lagwagon, of all people, he turned me onto this record, which is not what you think Joey would be listening to. It's that guy, Tuck Smith. Have you heard of that guy?
My favorite album of the last 12 months, dude.
Fucking great record. It's such a great record. But he's done a really good job almost scientifically breaking down what it is about he actually has a great playlist on his Spotify page where you can read it, and it's Thin Lizzy, The Replacements, a lot of these cool things, and he found a really artful way of creating something new out of that. But it doesn't stray too far. To me, that's a cool way to do it. That's an effective way to do it. But then you've got artists like Turnstile, who are taking something and then they're bending it and breaking it and fucking with it and repurposing it and adding something new to it, something new, something old, something borrowed, something blue. And they're kind of doing that and they're creating something new. You know, it's like reclaimed barnwood. They're like taking old shit like hardcore and 90s, and then they're reshaping it and turning it into something that feels sort of like, it feels just familiar enough that it's like, okay, this is rock music, but it feels like the future. Honestly, like with all due respect to rock and roll, I think rock and roll has kind of lagged. I think pop music has done a really good job moving forward into the future. And I think hip hop music has done a really good job doing that, you know, on a consistent basis where it's like hip hop today does not sound like hip hop yesterday and doesn't sound like hip hop 20 years ago. It's influenced by it, but it keeps moving forward. And I think pop music, if you listen to like Doja Cat, more recent Ariana Grande records, or even Dua Lipa, a lot of these big pop records, it's like people say what they want. It's sort of an easy target to be like, to sort of dismiss pop music. But actually, it's like, there's some really fucking dope, daring, cool shit happening there that rock music should sort of be ashamed of itself for being so conservative, because hip hop and pop have such a progressive spirit right now. And rock and roll is supposed to be the one in the fucking room that's shaking shit up. And I think, unfortunately, what happens to rock and roll every once in a while is the past is so fucking cool. And I'm guilty of it myself. I'm a total fucking history buff. I love cool old shit. But it's important to constantly remind yourself that the cool old shit is cool because of when it happened. You can form a band that looks and sounds exactly like the Stooges today, and it's not going to be as cool as the Stooges. Yeah. But I'll tell you who is as cool as the Stooges. Go see fucking Plague Vendor, or go see fucking Destroy Boys or something like that. And you're going to see something that has that spirit of cool, but it's not necessarily this like Renaissance fair, Civil War reenactment, like sort of imitation of that, which is so tempting to do because that shit's so fucking cool. But it's like, move it forward. You know who also does a good job moving shit forward? I think Jack White moves shit forward. He borrows from the past a lot, but he moves it forward. He's got that sort of hip hop ethic of like, I can't do it the same way it's already been done. I have to fucking make it my own. And I think that's cool. That's one of the things I tell people. I try to take the cape off the superhero and just be like, look, dude, this shit is not only for other people. You and your friends could do this shit. It's not only for virtuosos. None of my friends are virtuosos. Chris is pretty fucking good at guitar, but he still takes guitar lessons. You know, he's fucking like on a lifelong quest to fucking learn how to play guitar. And once he learned rock music inside and out, he started learning about country music. And he's like obsessed with that now. So there's no there. You have to sort of remain a student of life and constantly like check out new shit. You know, if I'm talking to young people, I'm always like, look, man, the music from the generations before you were around is always going to seem more sexy and cool because it's kind of like framed with time. But like, don't forget to look around like your own friends in your own scene. Like I said, that's where I got most of my influence, was looking around the kids in my own community that were like a few years older than me. And you learn and you get inspired. And then eventually someone becomes successful. Like I said, Toad the Wet Sprocket or Lagwagon or whatever. And that just blows your mind because you're like, dude, I remember you used to see that kid walking around town or like going to the same guitar store as me or going to hanging out in the same record store. And so that becomes really inspiring, you know. And our town, you know, it's weird. Santa Barbara, like Mad Caddies, the Ataris, so many bands came out of Santa Barbara that went on to do shit. But like our town was a pretty sleepy town.
How crazy is that?
Yeah, if you live in some sort of sleepy town, that doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's actually, in our case, it was good because we could all learn from each other and share resources and kind of become a big fish in a small pond. So you would develop that confidence that when you finally do go down to like a bigger place like LA, or I guess in your area it would be like London, you're not coming into London with no one knowing who you are. You've already like developed what you do in your own neighborhood. You know, and if you study about like Billy Idol or Depeche Mode or any of those bands, like they did the same thing, hanging out in fucking Basildon with their group of friends, taking the tube into London to watch the Sex Pistols and the Damned, and then going back home and forming their own bands. And no one cared about it or paid attention to it until they got it good. And then they started coming in and they started getting discovered by like Rough Trade and Mute and all that kind of cool shit. I mean, every artist, that's another thing I tell people to do is don't just fall in love with your heroes and hang them up on your wall. Fall in love with your heroes' roots. If you look at a superstar band today, it's going to seem impossible. It's going to be like, how do you ever get started? But if you trace their roots, everybody started somewhere. Usually they have pretty humble beginnings. So, and there's so many like documentaries and books and been on so many rabbit holes on the internet. So it's like, don't just like look at Dua Lipa and say, I want to be Dua Lipa. Look at how she got to be Dua Lipa. Lady Gaga didn't start out a superstar. She started out in like underground little fucking nightclubs in New York City. Blink-182 didn't start out playing stadiums. They started out as like the opening band for No Use for a Name. You know what I mean? Like, so like once you trace the roots, you start to realize like, okay, this is possible and it's not going to be overnight, but it's going to be fun. And honestly, when you talk to anyone in big bands, their most exciting stories are the stories from when they were struggling. If you want to talk to Green Day, their interview is not going to be interesting because they're going to tell you like how they're flying private jets and sleeping in Four Seasons. Cool stories about Green Day are when they were touring in a converted bookmobile and playing fucking squats. Having Trey Cool's dad be their driver and sleeping on the fucking floor of venues. Like, those are the fun stories. So, like, embrace that era. Embrace the early days of your career. That's one of the things I try to empower people with. Don't be ashamed of it or feel like what you're doing isn't legit. Do it the best you can and then just grow it little by little. And I think if you don't focus on the outcome, if you focus on the process, then shit usually works out a lot more often.
Have you ever passed on the advice that the guy from Blackboard Jungle told you when you was young to make yourself irreplaceable in a band?
Oh, totally, dude. You definitely did your research. So back in the day, when I was a kid, my band, when I was a teenager with Chris Shiflett from the Foos and Steve Sherlock, who would go on to be the drummer of Nerf Herder, and Luke Tierney, who today is in a band called Double Cobra, we had a band called Lost Kittens, okay, with a Z, of course, because, we were all about Hanoi Rocks and that band, The Cult. We loved Aerosmith, like vintage Aerosmith. Then we also loved Faster and Guns and all that stuff. But we eventually, I was still in high school, but Luke and Chris were a little bit older than me and they moved down after they were done with high school. And they got an apartment in Hollywood and got this rehearsal space called Hollywood and Western. We shared it with a band from the East Coast who had moved out to LA called Blackboard Jungle. So we got to know them and they were sort of like our older brothers in a way because we would sit around, like talk to them, be at the studio. So I would drive all the way from Santa Barbara while I was still in high school down to LA, this sketchy neighborhood, practice, and then drive all the way back. I don't know how I pulled that off. But I remember Britt, who was the main songwriter and the bass player of Blackboard, he would tell me one time, he's like, dude, the most important advice I can tell you is to make sure you make yourself irreplaceable. Be the guy in the band that the band would be a different band if they didn't have you in it. Try to like ingratiate yourself into the inner workings of the band. So I just always remember that. I was like, I'm never just going to be like a musician. I'm also going to be like the guy who books the shows. I'm also going to be the guy who comes up with the marketing ideas. I'm also going to be the guy who like networks and meets other bands and goes out and flyers and passes out stickers or goes out to shows. I spent just as much time going out to other people's shows, probably twice as much time going out to other people's shows and supporting the scene. Like if you had a band and you lived in my town, I'd come see your show and I would just show up to places and be there and just, I worked at the local record store. I just tried to make myself as like integrated into this music community as possible. I had a local music radio show. I would play all the local bands for half an hour a week on a Sunday night, just like try to do everything possible to like get myself tangled into the music community so that like, I'm not gonna say you couldn't have it without me, but I was a big part of it. If someone would say something about our scene, my name would probably come up in the conversation. That all grew out of that advice I got when I was like 16 years old, talking to Britt from Blackboard. We try to make yourself irreplaceable. And I think that's important, and I think if you look at Sugarcult as a band, some people know Sugarcult, some people probably like, who the fuck is Sugarcult? There's certain bands like, I don't name names, but like there's certain bands out there where you think of the singer and then some other random people behind it. Like I'm sure their fans know who they all are or whatever. But in our band, we always wanted to like be one of those bands like the Ramones or the Beatles or Kiss, where like you had a relationship with each member of the band. It wasn't just the singer and the backup band.
People in the audience had different favorite members.
Yeah. And everyone in the band had their own identity. We had maybe somewhat of a cohesive look, but you could still tell who was who. And I was, like I said, I'm a fan way before I'm a musician. When we started the band, we're like, let's form the band we wish existed. Would we want to be fans of this band? Would we want to wear that shirt? Would we want to see that show? Would we want to hear this song on a record? Because you know how it feels when you first get a record, you open it up and you're like, dude, I'm so stoked. You're checking out the artwork and you're like looking at all the details, and then you pull out the record and you put it on. It's so awesome when it exceeds your expectations. And then it's such a bummer when it sucks. We would like nearly get in fist fights with each other. We have 3 records, and each one of those records, we probably almost broke up over the argument about what songs in what order we were going to put on the record.
Because you cared so much.
Well, we cared so much, but at the same time, it's kind of absurd because our records came out in the early 2000s when people were probably going to just buy them a la carte on iTunes anyway. But we were still like thinking like, dude, this is side 1 and this is side 2. And it's so fucking stupid. Typical you that you would want that to be the first song. No way, we got to do this. And like we would like come to blows over this shit because it's just like it just mattered so much because it was like, my dream is to have some kid out there be like counting the days till our record comes out and then getting it and then putting it on and feeling like they think they're expecting it to be like, maybe it's going to be like, as good as the last record. I hope it's as good, and then having them just be like, holy shit, this is fucking great. And then want to like tell all their friends about it. Like you just kind of want to make that record, not to be like, I don't know. I don't think it's good manners to talk like this, but I do feel like enough years have gone by that I can speak to Sugarcult's catalog with objectivity and not sound like an arrogant fucking narcissist. But like, I really feel like those records, I'm really proud of those records. I listen to those records and I don't just hear the music. I hear the decisions and I hear the restraint and I hear us having the discipline not to fall prey to like the trends of the day because there was so much happening in the music culture that we got sort of put in with. There was like screamo and there was this and there was this, that, and the other. And there was like electro clash punk and all this kind of and dance punk. And I liked all that shit. It was all cool, but it's so tempting to like get the haircut, get the sound, start playing the music like that. And we really were steadfast about like trying to just be Sugarcult. We're like, we have this vision. We're going to resist the temptation to follow the trends because that's what we think we are supposed to do to be famous or something like that. It was like, for whatever reason, what we're doing seems to be working. So if you listen to each of the 3 studio records we made, they each have their own personality. They're 3 Sugarcult records, but each one represents a different era of Sugarcult. So the first one, it's like, that's like the record of us being a band, playing little like dive bars in Santa Barbara and growing up and kind of figuring out who we were going to be. And then the second record is this document of like, we've gone around the world. We've kind of gone from being the tiny opening band to being a band that can play, to our own crowd around the world. Now we're coming home to make that record. And it changes you once you start touring. You come home and you're never really the same again. So you're going to make a different record then. And then the third record was, in my opinion, it's our best record, Lights Out. It's probably the one that least people have heard. But I think it really captured what we were trying to get to. If you listen to that record, then you go back and listen to the earlier records, you see these little like clues, So I think it's a really cool trilogy. To me, it's like Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi. I still remain hopeful that we'll come back and make, The Force Awakens.
Marko, I've absolutely loved this. Thank you for so many brilliant stories. I could listen to them all day.
Yeah, for sure, man. So yeah, look me up if you guys follow me on Instagram, I usually post about like doing a lot of like DJ gigs, and my DJ gigs are super fun because it's not just like, I'm not just back there like playing music. I'm like really, telling stories and engaging with the crowd. And sometimes I'll get up on stage with like, if there's a band playing, and I'll play a Sugarcult song. It's a fun celebration. I get everybody up on stage and it's just a big hang session.
Where can people pick up that Popsico record?
Oh, good question. So there's a label called Big Stir Records. I think you can link to it through my Instagram. If you go to my Instagram, to Marko DeSantis, and go to my link tree, I think I have a direct link to how you can get it, but they're very limited edition. They might be sold out, but hopefully they're not, because it's got the record with the book. So it's a package, you get it together. So you get the record and the book together. I think it's like $20 or $25, but there's only like a few hundred of these made. You could check us out on like streaming platforms. I think they have not the whole record, but a few of the songs. But if you want the record, if you're the kind of person like me and you want to collect this kind of shit, it's got tons of cool shit, collage of pictures, liner notes, and like old flyers. And then, like I said, the book. It's a really good record. So yeah, Big Stir Records. I'm sure they have like a website and all that cool shit. And then Sugarcult 20th anniversary edition of Start Static came out on vinyl. about 2 years ago or something like that. There might be one or two of those left, but again, online you can listen to the 20-year anniversary edition. We put a couple live versions of our songs on there. And then the other project I have is Bad Astronaut, and that's with Joey Cape from Lagwagon. And we do this really weird sort of indie, progressive, weird kind of band called Bad Astronaut. And we just put out like a box set of vinyl during the pandemic, and a long out of print split EP we did with a band called Armchair Martian just came out on Fat Records, got re-released on Fat Records recently. So look up Bad Astronaut, look up Popsicle, look up Sugarcult, and find me on Instagram and DM me if you have any questions. I usually reply to people. So yeah, fuck yeah, dude. Thanks for having me. We covered some ground. I've done a lot of podcasts, a lot of interviews, but I don't think we ever covered that. Like, you made a really good point, like covering that ground as far as that like missing link with like Guns N' Roses, Poison, Faster Pussycat. You know, that's something people just generally didn't want to talk about, because it sort of became like this weird, like,
look at my wall.
Yeah, you were sort of embarrassed by it for a while. You're like, oh God. After the 90s kicked in, it was almost like that stuff all seemed like a lot of those bands made like kind of shitty records too. And it's just like something you were like, dude, I don't want to die on that hill. Yeah. We were just young enough that was like, okay, we're on to fucking the new generation now. But then you go back and you kind of go, you know what, man? Some of those records were fucking great. That first Motley Crue record is a fucking masterpiece. You know what I mean? That's the cool thing about music. There's so much great shit out there and it never ends. You know, there's still fucking cool shit from the 60s and 70s that they're putting out that you didn't know existed, and you'll go back and listen to it and realize like, fuck, this record never got any attention because it was eclipsed by this other big record. I mean, to me, that's just part of the joy of being a lifelong music fan, is it's just an endless supply of cool shit to go back and revisit. I'll even get on kicks where I'll go back and listen to like the Rolling Stones records that I dismissed, you know, because I had this sort of attitude like, oh, they never put anything good out past Tattoo You. And then I go back and listen to like Dirty Work, you know, Undercover. And you're like, well, they're not great records, but there's still some really good songs on there. It's just, I don't know. It's fun to geek out.
You enjoy the rest of your day, man. I've loved it. It's been an absolute pleasure.
All right, buddy. Take care. Thanks a lot for your time.
How great was Marko DeSantis? So cool to learn about his journey, but also his appreciation and just pure love and joy of music, which obviously means so much to him today. I took a lot from that chat and I came away a little energized and inspired, so I hope you did too. Make sure to follow Marko on Instagram at Marko DeSantis and check out all the cool stuff he's up to today. And why not dive back into his back catalogue as well, as there's some real gems to be found. If I can ask a favour of you all, I'd love it if you could head on over to my YouTube page, which is at STV Podcast, or just maybe search Straight to Video Podcast on YouTube and it should come up. I'm putting a lot more content on there from the show, including clips from many of the episodes, so please, if you can, head on over there and check it out. Obviously, all previous full episodes of the show continue to be found at stvpod.com. So that's all for this episode. I'll be back next Friday. And until then, always be kind, please rewind and unwind, and I'll speak to you all real soon.